Well, thanks very much, Anne, for that very nice introduction. But it's really an honor to be here at Waterloo School of Architecture for the 50th anniversary, partly because I was part of that first group of students at the School of Architecture here. And to be invited to speak on this theme of unprecedented opportunities and unforeseen brutalities. I chose to speak about our work over the last, well, 4.5 decades, really, from the theme of architecture with vulnerable people during turbulent times. As I said, I was one of the first students back in 50 years ago, 1968. 1968 was a really momentous year for us all, but in the first year, the school had arranged an orientation trip to Chicago, of all places, which, with the vision that this was a showcase for the evolution of the modern movement. Was set up for us to stay at the famous Mies van der Rohe campus at IIT in Chicago. But it was interesting, we discovered that the IIT campus had been, was built on not only our school here, but the IIT campus was built on expropriated land. In this case, from one of, expropriated land from one of Chicago's most violent slum neighborhoods, which at the time had a mortality rate due to urban violence that was said to exceed the mortality rates on the frontline zones of the Vietnam War. So this new campus was situated in basically the boundaries were slum communities in Chicago. Now, Chicago, 1968, those of you who were around then, possibly most of you weren't, but may remember that this was an important year. It was the year of rising student movement, the anti-war movement, but also a rising social movement around the issues of land and urban space. This was a worldwide movement, actually, and Paris 1968 was largely led by architectural students from the Sorbonne, and inspired by the sociologist, the French philosopher André Lefebvre, who wrote his thesis, The Right to the City, which has basically inspired a social movement that continues today. A social movement that looks at the concept of the right to the city as a human right. Gloria from Latin America will probably give evidence that Latin American cities have taken this banner of the rights to the city in Brazil, Mexico, Ecuador, and passed human rights legislation that protects the concept of equitable cities and the rights to all of citizenship in the city to the poor as well as the wealthy and middle class. My colleagues in my organization has been involved with campaigning for the rights to the city and having the concept of the rights to the city incorporated into international human rights practice. And we successfully had the concept of the right to the city embedded in the new urban agenda that was published by UN Habitat and endorsed by all the countries of the world in Quito, Ecuador in 2 years ago, or 18 months ago in 2016. Well, Anne mentioned that after Waterloo, I went to London. I joined the Architectural Association. And I got together at that time with a group of students largely from developing countries. And in 1973, we formed a working group at the AA and called it Development Workshop. And with a commitment to, after we graduated, which we did together, to continue working together in less developed communities in developing countries. And our work has, from the beginning, focused on participatory urban development, this concept which is embedded in the right to the city idea, on shelter, social housing, basic services and infrastructure, post-conflict construction or reconstruction, and you'll see from our work that we have worked largely in conflict and post-conflict countries, hence the vulnerable communities, turbulent times heading for this presentation, and increasingly on environmental issues related to climate change. Our first opportunities grew out of the first Vancouver Habitat Conference, so the first Habitat Conference in 1976, that featured our work in some exhibitions and several invitations to work in different countries came out of that. The first one was the opportunity to work in the Sahel in West Africa, where we've been engaged for the last 40 years, in fact, around addressing issues related to environmental degradation caused by climate change, and looking at adaptation of human settlements, but really dealing with the problems related to environmental change and increased civil conflict that has emerged in the Sahel region. One of the impacts of climate change in the area, and exacerbated by the cutting of timber for construction purposes, that wood was becoming a more scarce commodity. And the traditional forms of construction that depended on organic materials, wood particularly, were increasingly difficult for people to use. The increasing transport also resulted in the extraction of organic materials and timber from the region. But the impact of climate change and deforestation also pushed populations out of the region into the urban areas, and invariably resulted in conflict that is rooted in environmental resource extraction. So most of the traditional types of construction were no longer possible, so durable houses were impossible to reproduce using traditional technologies in the region. Now, the impact of climate change also affected Egypt and the Middle East 3.5 millennium ago, when timber resources were also scarce in countries like Egypt in the Pharaonic era. And the architectural response was the development of earth adobe shell construction, that eliminated the need for use of timber in the construction, and actually eliminated the need for formwork that is part of the shell construction in European architecture. Some of the most sophisticated earth shell type vault and dome technology developed in arid regions of Iran in latter years. Now, the late Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi brought these techniques into the 20th century in his work in Egypt, began in the 1940s, in fact, and adapting some of these traditional techniques for social housing in Egypt. Myself and my colleagues of Development Workshop had the privilege of working with Hassan Fathi through the 1970s. We did our graduate research with him. And Hassan Fathi researched and applied traditional adobe construction for low-cost housing, and pioneered some of the ideas around, and in his publication Architecture for the Poor, very much mentored us in our early days of work as well. Development Workshop, out of the first Habitat meeting in '76, were invited to the Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso to introduce a South-South technology transfer using some of Hassan Fathi's ideas and the technology from Egypt and Iran to countries of the Sahel. Development Workshop has been involved in the Sahelian countries for the last 40 years now, since the late 70s, training local builders and adapting local architecture to use shell-based earth construction for again for for housing and public buildings. Through training of local builders, we've been involved with building projects, but our main work and our work over the decades has been through training really thousands of local builders in workshops on basically transferring the technology from Egypt and Iran. Development Workshop won the 1998 World Habitat Award for the promotion of woodless construction in the Sahel. And over the years, thousands of domestic and public buildings have been built using this technology, but by local builders. The technology has been adapted into the local vernacular now. Following our work on environmental adaptation, Development Workshop was invited to work in Vietnam, particularly addressing the environmental problem related to typhoon and flood resistance in the coastal region. Vietnam, of course, suffered decades of war as well, and emerged out of the conflict and faced environmental problems every year with devastating typhoons that affected coastal settlements. And our approach was investing in the traditional building and improving it by public education around adaptation of buildings for prevention of damage due to cyclones. Again, capacity building with local builders, building skills, doing demonstration projects, and providing microcredit for household improvement for communities. So Development Workshop also won a World Habitat Award in 2008 for our work in typhoon-resistant housing and construction in Vietnam. Now, finally, I'm going to present case study of our work in Angola, where I'm based currently. And as I mentioned to Robert, we were involved in Angola through the 1980s, a time of war, civil war, very much connected with the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and we did a lot of work with South African and Namibian refugees who had fled the conflict areas. But I'm going to talk about really the issue about what to do when the fighting stops in a country. And Angola suffered 40 years of conflict, liberation war, the civil war connected with the changes in the struggle against apartheid in southern Africa, but emerged from war to peace in 2002. At the end of the war, Angola registered some of the highest child mortality rates in the world. More than, well, 1 in 4 children died before their 5th birthday. Extreme poverty, and that map there shows at the end of the war, the red areas or the pink areas are the land controlled by government. The rest of the countryside was landmined, controlled by rebel opposition groups. So there's a big challenge of post-war reconstruction, and that's what we've been largely involved with in the last 15 years or so in Angola. The war not only devastated the country physically, but eroded institutions, and institutions are more difficult to reconstruct than housing and physical infrastructure. The war encouraged mistrust in communities, even in families, eroded social capital, and at the end of the war, people tended to hang on to their arms as an insurance policy. Remember that map of the country? Roughly 30% of the national territory was suitable for resettlement of the roughly 4 million population that was displaced or had sought refuge in neighboring countries. And of course the problem of landmines and destroyed infrastructure. But the war produced a massive shift of population to the relative safe havens of the cities. Luanda, in the years that I have lived in or been based in Luanda, grew from a city of 750,000 to over 7 million today. So it's grown tenfold. And the city has grown. What has grown is the slum areas we call museks on the periphery of the city. And this gives an idea of the kind of rapid growth and the demographic characteristics of the city today. But as I mentioned, the social roles are extremely important, and the changing roles of women in Angolan urban areas was important in terms of women emerged as largely the breadwinners and provided families, sustained families during the conflict years and the post-conflict years. Development Workshop focused on some of the immediate problems of water sanitation. Was one of the problems articulated by most communities, and over the years following the war, built around 1,500 water systems that were all community managed and through community engagement participation in both rural and urban areas, and engaged with rebuilding the educational infrastructure in the country. Throughout the country, 60% of schools had been destroyed, and in the Central Highlands, which was the hottest conflict point in the country, where Development Workshop is most engaged, and 80% of the schools had been destroyed. So we have focused a lot of our efforts in rebuilding school infrastructure, built 130 schools with local communities, and a program of training ex-combatants as builders and getting them involved in a program that uses local materials. It was impossible during the conflict years even to get a bag of cement into the conflict areas in the Central Highlands. So as you can see, Development Workshop had been doing work with adobe and stabilized earth construction over the years. So this technology was well adapted to the conflict and post-conflict environment where local materials were, we had no other choice. But this is some of the schools that and water systems that we were involved in building with communities and creating employment through the use of local materials, local timber. But I mentioned the challenge and the leadership that women had assumed in the urban areas and in the resettlement process, and we saw that most women and most of the employment was in the informal economy, and the way really to stimulate and encourage poverty reduction or in the informal economy is through microfinance. And we engaged in a partnership with Grameen Bank in Bangladesh and did another South-South transfer of technology and into supporting micro enterprises. Presently we're financing about 45,000 micro businesses every year with a budget of around $25 million in recycling loans to those communities. But we have also taken microfinance and applied it to housing and are using microloans to finance incremental housing. That really serves the African tradition of building housing in phases over time as the family grows, and at the time of family retirement having rental space to sustain the family in their retirement years. We have been also involved in the post-conflict era in a program of municipal development, building municipalities through engaging communities in municipal forums and participatory municipal planning. And that work continues today as I was mentioning to Robert, we have a reform government in Angola in the last few months that has picked up many of our ideas, and actually many of our staff are now senior people in government who have been seconded to work on these national programs of decentralization, land reform, etc., that we have been engaged in over the years. Back in 1989, with support from IDRC from Canada, Development Workshop launched Angola's first pre-internet project of providing communications through a system called AngoNet that still is running today. And we use the AngoNet to get a lot of our research and information into the public domain. And continue to be engaged with support from Canada through IDRC in urban adaptation to climate change. And you can see this reflected in our work in the Sahel and Vietnam, as well as Angola, working on issues of making cities resilient but equitable through addressing environmental vulnerability, using, these are the coastal cities that we're engaged with in Angola with support from IDRC, using participatory mapping and GIS techniques to develop resiliency plans for municipalities up and down the coast, and the kinds of risk maps that help urban planners to invest in mitigation programs. Development Workshop was also awarded a UN Habitat Best Practices Award, as well as a Southern Africa Drivers for Change Award that was a regional award. And as Anne mentioned, I've just returned from Dubai, where DW was, or Development Workshop was invited to, by UN Habitat to present a case study of our post-award work over how we're using the recognition of good practice to influence government policy and scale up the impact. And very much connected with our current and ongoing work in the global campaign of the Right to the City. So that's my last slide. And I just wanted to make a mention of in parallel to UN Habitat, Development Workshop was one of the founders back in 1976 of the Habitat International Coalition, which is a consortium of civil society, non-governmental, and academic institutions that advocate for principles like the rights to the city, gender rights to housing and land tenure, and we continue to be very much engaged in that process. So I hope I can, the presentation has shown you how, to some extent, the inspiration from the social movements that grew out of 1968, and I had the privilege of being exposed to through the School of Architecture's trip to Chicago, where we were expected to go on tours to see Mies van der Rohe and Frank Lloyd Wright, and the trajectory of the evolution of the modern movement. I took the opportunity to attend a number of meetings of the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, and introduce myself to my lifelong passion to Chicago blues. So I have to thank, the opportunities that Waterloo presented at that time to really develop an approach to social architecture rather than classic approach to architecture. So thank you very much.
Going back to what we were doing through this series of conversations and looking at how are we teaching architecture, what can architectural education do? And the fact that you opened with that trip to Chicago, where in fact, we were taking the students to see, the lessons you didn't learn from their organized trip. And I'm wondering, are we still making the same mistakes and, sometimes trying to teach the things that do not matter as much? Or, I guess one side of this question would be, going back to the education, what were some of the things that kind of prepared you to some of the questions that now you're engaging in? Or what are the things that were not there that you wish you had maybe been exposed to an extent?
Well, maybe I can start with this one. I don't think it was a mistake to take us to Chicago. I think this was the challenge, and the fact that I got something that was unintended from that trip. I did the tour of the history of the modern movement, et cetera, but I came away with a a very different experience that related to the changes that were, the social movements that were emerging in cities like Chicago during that time. But I think in terms of architectural education, what was fascinating about Waterloo at that time was that, we had some professors who were steeped in the modern movement, which was dying in '68, of course. We were already moving to postmodernism, but I think there's useful lessons in the modern movement. But the challenge at Waterloo was the inspiring professors that we had. We had duality. I mean, we had a really my friend and mentor Fred Thompson, who joined us, I think, when I was in my first 1B or something like that. And Fred had come from studying under Marshall McLuhan and Jane Jacobs, and brought, some really new ideas that really excited me. Murray Macquarie, who launched the first iconography program, as I was telling Robert, our first reading list that Murray handed out was Thomas Aquinas, that you still read, but also Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. We were in the midst of the Cultural Revolution in China at the time. So, Larry Cummings and Bob Wilger and people who were inspired us to think very differently and outside the box very much.
I'd like to turn it over if there are any questions by people in the audience. Yes. Do I get to stand up? Fred? There's Fred. Okay, I'll give you this. I have to pick it. Yes, I think there's Fred Thompson by Fred Hansberger.
This won't hurt. Allan, the question I have is how you balance goodwill with skill, I guess. And I have an issue of Le Monde Diplomatique here with me, which talks about a $50 billion side industry which is supplying housing and everything else. IKEA, for example, has got enormous interests in housing for refugees, for military camps, and so on and so forth. How you balance that with the indigenous needs and the indigenous way. And the story comes to mind of, it's about 20 years ago, I guess, I read in the Guardian Weekly of a woman who had donated her clothes to charity in Africa. And what she decided to do was to follow her clothes to Africa. Do you know the story? And to her surprise, what happened was that people bought the clothes, but by buying the clothes cheaply because it had been given, they displaced the very people who were trying to make a living in Africa making clothes. And so now we have a $50 billion euro industry supplying support through aid agencies. How do you balance? You must be in the midst of that balancing act, especially with your trips to China.
If we look at Africa, where I'm doing most of my work today, and it's good that you mentioned China, because they are now the principal financiers for urbanization and housing in Africa, and in many cases exporting failed projects from China to Africa, building ghost cities, and in Africa using recycled plans and drawings from projects in China. But they're bringing investment in capital they've also built some very useful transport systems, but I'm particularly interested in looking at the urban investments in housing and urban development. And Africa and developing countries need the investment. So what I'm particularly interested in is looking at some of the spectacular urban development that's happened in China. And it's largely based on we call land value capture. In China, the land is still owned by the state. It's like many African post-socialist countries where land was nationalized by the state, but it's leased out, and much of these fabulous cities like Shenzhen and others have been financed through real estate development, quite capitalist approaches. But we've set up a program now in a partnership with the Africa Center for Studies in Peking, at Beijing University, where we've engaged with with Chinese social scientists to look at good practice in Africa and trying to influence that process of financing of urban development and housing, and promoting good practice and lessons learned from good practice rather than replicating bad ideas. Chinese weren't the first to introduce bad ideas into southern, the global south. I mean, Europe and North America have been doing that for decades. So, what we're trying to promote is good practice that has grown from local adaptation of technology. It was very interesting to see Gloria's construction of the catenary, because that work that we were doing with Hassan Fassi is all based on catenary arches, basically. And before that, when I was on a work term, I worked with Frei Otto in Germany at the time of the construction of the Munich Olympic Stadium, and he had me working on a project in adapting these fabric tensile structures in desert conditions. So it's really very interesting that some of the traditional approaches to the shell structures that you've been using in Paraguay also have roots in Africa and the Middle East.
I'm not going to ask about the building code and building code enforcement in Asunción, but it is a question which is of interest. Now, but the question I would like to ask to both of you concerns the following big picture of history, 4,000 years of history. And that is that renewal, innovation, has always come from the periphery. The Greeks were renewed by Macedonia. The Roman Empire was renewed first by what happened in Jerusalem. Afterwards, it was the barbarians moving in, the Franks moving in from the north. Gallo-Roman culture was renewed by the Normans coming in, and also architectural innovation each time came from the periphery to the center. So if we now for a moment assume that you are in some way at that periphery, the barbarians at the gate, so to speak, and now you're looking back at the center, you look back at what is supposed to be the capitals of good architecture, and that could be, or bad architecture, but at least where all the money is being spent. And so if you were to speculate about how your practices could actually start to overturn what we're doing here in Toronto, in Paris, in Beijing right now, where the architecture, in some ways, the architecture of the great, but it's being published, where the architectural histories, they focus still on these large capital projects. What do you think 30 years from now, a historian like myself would say about the impact of your peripheries on our centers?
Yeah, that's a pretty provocative question there. But I was telling Anne over a glass of wine before we started that I was teaching a course in Ottawa, jointly between the University of Ottawa and Carleton, on it's called Urban Challenges in the Global South. And I use a case study approach that really looks at good practice, world city good practice in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. You know, where I think, Robert, you're talking about maybe new ideas will come, and it's looking at the course deals with looking at those good practices, but in each case challenged by a dilemma that the good practice hadn't foreseen, and cracks appearing basically in those nice solutions that we give awards to. And when you go back 5 years later and really see what the new problems that have emerged, and so I think dealing with those dilemmas and looking at how communities or local authorities, local government has dealt with some of those challenges to what we have interpreted as good practice. I mean, those maybe provide some of the seeds for the new lessons that we should be learning from. I find actually looking at these dilemmas to be really, really quite fascinating, and maybe the new solutions will emerge from them, and they will be temporary solutions as always, because environment is changing, the social conditions in the world are changing, and the centers of power in the world are moving south as well. So these are all considerations, and a little bit that these turbulent times that I talked about are not going to end soon. Yes.
I guess I have more of a question for Allan. In terms of development work, generally requires a partnership with the government. So unlike emergency humanitarian aid, which generally works on the principles of impartiality and neutrality, development work has to be more connected to the politics of the nation that it's working with. And I'm just curious, how does the work kind of gets carried through, or gets done in nations that are still under a corrupt regime, for example, as a lot of the South is currently? So how can you kind of work through that and still achieve sort of the goals that you want?
Yeah, neutrality was important in our work during the conflict years in Angola. Well, during the war years, there were we were involved in support for some of the building activities of South African and Namibian refugees in Angola, which was the base for the fight against apartheid during the 1980s. And neutrality didn't enter into that question. We were very partisan, felt very much strongly as part of an anti-apartheid movement and supporting that. But in the Civil War years in Angola, we had the opportunity of working on both sides of the Civil War. And in fact, by doing that and being one of the humanitarian organizations that was able to move across the conflict lines, we were able to actually contribute to the peace process in Angola. So much of our work, and I didn't talk about those years actually in my presentation, but much of my work in the 1990s, 80s and 90s, but mainly in the 90s, was involved in humanitarian kinds of activities, but still through architecture and planning and dealing with refugees and displaced people in urban areas and in rural areas. But that gave us the opportunity of being able to bring people that we worked, civil society organizations on both sides, religious church organizations and civil society organizations. And we got very much engaged with the peace process in Angola. And in fact, the Order of Canada that I received was partly in recognition of the work in peace and conflict that I didn't see as being really distinct from my work in settlements and housing. But so I don't think that was neutral. It was very much getting engaged with communities. And we work with government when we can find champions for positive champions in government. And that's the strategy for working with government. There are always champions for positive change, even in some of the more autocratic regimes. And by engaging with them, one can promote change. Fortunately, in Angola today, we have a new reform government, and many of the policies that we have been advocating for around gender rights to land and real participatory approaches to governance are being picked up by government. In fact, a lot of my staff has been recruited into government, and some of my colleagues are now quite senior in government. So, engagement over those years has produced opportunities to affect positive change in not only in the physical infrastructure of cities and housing, but also in some of the policies related to urban development.
Well, I'd have to say thank you for speaking tonight. Out of the 6 conversations, this was probably close to being the highlight for myself. In 1975, I was 18 years old, approximately, and studying construction technology. And we would have to go and do that ourselves. We would have to build with bricks and get our hands dirty. And it wasn't until later that I got accepted to a school of architecture, but in the process of learning how to make things with my hands, it was wonderful. But I also got to meet people from other countries. I volunteered in the community, and one of the things that I was most proud of doing is meeting foreign students from Africa, from India, that would come to the University of Waterloo, and I would show them what shopping in a grocery store was about. And they've been my lifelong friends. They went back to their countries, Nigeria. And then some of my friends locally, growing up in a Baptist and Mennonite churches, they made some money in their lifetime, and they're my age now, and they're successfully retired, but they went off to do missionary work in South America and Africa. One friend in particular is teaching people in Burkina Faso how to make bricks. So I think tonight was very interesting for myself. And the joke, it was my life to grow up in the Catholic Church, and I heard that joke before about the brick and the smoke, or about the sorry, I'm getting this mixed up, the smoke and the prayer, and I heard this joke before. But your version is very nice, so thank you for telling that story. It is often, in between the two of you, it is often the prayer and the smoke.
And I really want to thank you again. And going back to the brick and the smoke. No, the brick. I think it was actually interesting. One thing that I forgot to mention. I think it's nice that we circle all the way back to adobe and brick and clay and concrete, because this is my thank you for also our sponsorship. Aristcraft lecture series. He's here, and so also representative Masonry Works. George Windsor is here today representing Aristcraft, and they've been funding the lecture series. So I think it's quite appropriate that you come for full-on Masonry lecture, in and amongst a lot of international and really quite outstanding architectural projects. So thank you very much. This was wonderful.